Get out of that seat right now, little girl. This is first class, not a place for you. The words sliced through the air, loud enough for every passenger boarding to hear. And they came from the mouth of Karen Fitzgerald, the lead flight attendant who carried herself with 20 years of so-called experience. Her tone dripping with authority and bias. Those words weren't whispered. They were shouted with an edge that stung far deeper than the command itself. Because they were not just aimed at a 12-year-old child. They were aimed at her dignity, her presence, and her right to belong in the very seat her mother had purchased for her with care. Before we go further into this story, comment where you're watching from, subscribe and hit like, because what you're about to hear deserves to be told and remembered now. Let us return to that scene in the first-class cabin of Delta Airlines Flight 456 at New York's JFK Airport, where Aaliyah Thompson, a composed young black girl dressed neatly in a crisp white blouse, gray skirt, and polished shoes, sat proudly in seat 1B, her monogrammed backpack with the initials AT tucked beneath the seat, her small hands folded in her lap, her heart racing yet steady, because this was her very first solo flight across the country, and though she had flown many times before with her family. This moment carried both excitement and responsibility. The ticket was not just any ticket. It was purchased by her mother, Serena Thompson, the billionaire CEO of Thompson Tech Solutions, a company valued at $2 billion, a firm that had fought its way into a powerful partnership with Delta itself, building AI systems to check tickets and secure flights, a firm that Serena had built from scratch after years of battling the walls of discrimination in both academia and business. Serena's husband, Dr. Marcus Thompson, a respected Harlem cardiologist, had always reminded their daughter of one lesson: when you are tested, remain calm, because truth speaks louder than shouting. And today those words would echo louder than ever before. As passengers settled into the luxury of first class, warm towels being offered and luggage stowed in the bins, Karen Fitzgerald stopped abruptly at row 1, her eyes locking on Aaliyah with suspicion that spoke volumes. "What are you doing in this seat?" she demanded, voice sharp, body stiff with a kind of authority that was more about exclusion than safety. Aaliyah, who had prepared herself for questions, opened her small leather boarding pass holder and presented it with composure. "This is my seat. 1B. Karen crossed her arms tightly, shook her head, and replied with that chilling smirk. "Unaccompanied minors don't sit in first class. Sweetheart, you need to follow me to economy." But Aaliyah, remembering her mother's instructions, did not bow her head. She looked straight at the woman and said, "My mom confirmed with Delta's VIP desk. I'm allowed here." That calm answer should have been enough, but Karen leaned closer and whispered harshly, "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Don't argue with me." She tapped her headset and spoke for everyone around to hear. "I need an agent in first class. Child in the wrong seat." The cabin grew tense. Maria Gonzalez, a Latina freelance journalist sitting just beside in 1C, leaned slightly toward the girl and whispered, "You're not doing anything wrong. Stay calm." On the other side, in seat 1A, Edward Harrington, a 65-year-old retired businessman with years of quiet privilege behind him, looked up briefly from his iPad, his conscience stirring as he remembered his own college days at Yale when he had remained silent as black classmates were mocked. Guilt pressed against his chest, yet he said nothing, his silence heavy. Jasmine Carter, a young black ground staffer who had been called into the cabin, walked in with her scanner, checked the ticket, and announced clearly, "Confirmed. Seat 1B, VIP priority." For a moment the truth rang out, yet Karen snapped back. "She's still a minor. Policy is policy." At that moment, Mark Henderson, the first officer, stepped out of the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his jaw tight, and asked, "What's the problem here?" Karen gestured toward Aaliyah. "She's in the wrong place." Without checking the pass, without hesitation, Mark said flatly, "Move her to economy. No disruptions before takeoff." And with those words, The weight of authority pressed down again. Aaliyah's eyes watered, her throat tightened, but she stood, clutching her backpack, and with a voice that trembled yet carried strength. She said, "You'll regret this." They led her down the aisle, past the stares of other passengers, some pitying, some indifferent, until she was placed in seat 25F, an economy seat near the emergency exit, a place reserved for adults, not children. Yet that detail mattered less to Karen and Mark than their determination to push her aside. She sat there, humiliated yet unbroken, pulled out her phone, and whispered into the receiver, "Mom, it's happening again." At that exact moment, miles away in her Manhattan office, Serena Thompson sat in a boardroom surrounded by Delta executives discussing the very future of AI systems for ticketing when her phone vibrated. She answered, and on the other end was her daughter's voice, soft and strained, telling her of the humiliation. The words sent Serena's heart racing and her blood boiling, because this was not the first time her family had been targeted. Memories flooded back. The time she had been followed in a store as a graduate student at MIT. The meetings where she had been talked over in Silicon Valley boardrooms. The years of building her company against currents of bias. She looked around that conference table, cut the meeting short, and said firmly, "My daughter is in trouble on your flight." Without hesitation, she used her partnership privileges to access the airport's internal system and saw the live footage of Karen ignoring the confirmed boarding pass. Her hands tightened into fists, her voice low but steady. "No one dims my daughter's light." She grabbed her bag, stormed out of the glass tower, and rushed toward her car. The driver pulled out into Manhattan traffic as she calculated the minutes, 10 miles to JFK, every second burning with urgency. She had faced billion-dollar negotiations with calm, but nothing could match the fire of a mother protecting her child. On board, passengers whispered, some shifting uncomfortably, others shaking their heads as though the girl's removal was her fault. Aaliyah sat in silence, holding back tears, but inside her mind a mantra repeated, her father's words, her mother's lessons, and her own determination not to be erased. Serena, now racing down the expressway, knew this would not end quietly, because this was bigger than one seat, bigger than one flight. This was about the right of every black child to be respected without question, and in 15 minutes, she would step onto that jet bridge and show the world what true power looked like. In seat 25F, the hum of the engines was faint, the chatter of boarding passengers louder, and Aaliyah sat with her back straight, trying to fight the sting in her eyes as she gripped her phone and her small leather journal, her heart heavy with shame that was not hers to carry, but pressed onto her by others who chose to see her skin before her humanity. She remembered her mother's voice as clearly as if Serena were sitting beside her, saying, "You are the daughter of a queen. You never bow." And with that in her heart, she whispered to herself, "I will not bow." Though the ache was strong and the isolation was sharper still. She sent a quick text to her best friend back home. "They kicked me out for being black. I hate flying." She wanted to add more but stopped, not wanting pity, because what she longed for was dignity, not sympathy. And as she sat there, she opened her journal and wrote, "Why is my skin a problem?" The words looked back at her like a reflection, one she never asked for, but one she could not escape. A flash of memory struck her. Last year's Boston to Miami trip, when she had been with her father, Dr. Marcus Thompson, and a flight attendant had questioned why he, a black man in a tailored suit, held a first-class ticket. She had watched his calm response, his quiet dignity, but in his eyes she had seen the weariness, the same weariness she now felt in her small bones, though she was only 12. Karen, meanwhile, stood in the galley laughing softly with another crew member, her tone dismissive, saying, "Kids these days think they own the world," her laugh masking a seed of unease, because deep inside even she knew the girl had done nothing wrong. She excused herself by calling it policy, but policy was never checked. And deep down, she knew it was not policy that guided her decision. It was bias she had never confronted. Mark Henderson, back in the cockpit, leaned in his seat, telling himself he had done the right thing to avoid a scene. But the truth was that he had relied on old prejudices he had carried since his Air Force days, where jokes about race and who belonged had been casual and unchecked, and though he wore a uniform of authority, his choices that day were built on the same shaky ground. Captain Ellis, experienced and steady, asked what the fuss had been about, and Mark shrugged, calling it a mix-up with a child. Brushing it off as though dignity was a trivial detail, the captain frowned but let it pass, telling himself there would be time later to address it, though he already felt the seed of doubt. On the jet bridge, Jasmine Carter, the young ground staffer, paced nervously with her phone, debating whether to call the VIP desk again. She knew the gravity of what had happened, because she herself had been on the receiving end of mistakes like this when she was younger, being told she did not belong, and the memory of those days in the Bronx, hearing taunts and feeling invisible, made her voice tremble but firm as she called the VIP desk. "This is Serena Thompson's daughter. She was removed from her first-class seat. This is serious. You need to escalate now." Maria Gonzalez, sitting in seat 1C, pulled out her notepad and scribbled furiously, her journalist instincts burning with anger at what she had witnessed, because she knew a story of injustice when she saw it, and her mind was already framing the words, 12-year-old girl removed from first class due to bias. Edward Harrington, in seat 1A, felt the weight of silence pressing on him, the guilt of not speaking up, the guilt that tied back decades to moments when he had watched injustice and said nothing. And he sat there sweating, torn between shame and the sudden urge to stand later when it would matter most. Meanwhile, the cabin grew restless. Passengers whispered about the delay. One man muttered, "Why are we still at the gate?" As though the child were the cause of the disruption, as though her presence in first class had been the problem all along. Aaliyah felt the sting of those whispers, the shame curling in her stomach. But she lifted her chin slightly, clutching her pen, reminding herself of her father's words, of her mother's strength, and though fear pressed on her chest, a quiet determination grew beneath it, fragile but unyielding. Outside, Serena's black car weaved through Manhattan traffic, her mind sharp, her breath steady, her heart a storm. She called her assistant, her tone clipped. "Pull the airport footage now. I need to see it." Within moments, the feed was on her tablet, showing Karen dismissing the scanned boarding pass, ignoring Jasmine's confirmation, pulling Aaliyah out of the seat without cause. Serena's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowed, and her voice, though calm, trembled with fury as she said, "This is not just about Aaliyah. This is about every black child who has been told they don't belong." Her mind drifted back to her days at MIT, when she was the only black woman in her class, when professors had dismissed her ideas until a white peer repeated them, when she had stayed up all night proving equations to earn respect that should have been given freely. She remembered walking into her first Silicon Valley pitch, watching investors dismiss her until the numbers spoke louder than their prejudice. And she thought, "Not again. Not my daughter." She thought of her company, Thompson Tech Solutions, born from those battles, built with fire and faith, now worth $2 billion and tied directly to Delta's systems. And she knew her leverage was stronger than any badge Karen or Mark could flash. On board. The whispers grew. A woman in row 12 whispered to her husband, "That little girl did nothing wrong," while another passenger shook his head, muttering, "Rules are rules." Aaliyah sat still, writing another line in her journal. Silence isn't safety. And as she pressed her pen harder, she thought of her mother racing